of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. DPadgett from Tennessee State University, and he's giving us some information in reference to the social impact of the Nashville flood of 2010. And of course, Dr. Padgett, let's pick up where we left off the first segment by talking about some of the impacts of weather upon the human existence in a real sense, and then get into the social impact of that flood of 2010 on people in Nashville.
Okay, well, what we looked at first was how to respond to these types of events, which with global warming we expect to see more of these extreme types of rain and tornadoes and other type of events that result in floods. Well, one of the things that came out of Hurricane Katrina was something that we call inner city emergency response. And we found out after Hurricane Katrina that we have to look at inner city populations a little bit differently. Inner city populations tend to be more vulnerable because the normal evacuation plan is get in your car and leave. Well, what if you don't have a car? What if you are a senior citizen and aren't necessarily very mobile? And so what happened after Hurricane Katrina was a series of what were called inner city emergency response workshops. And we had a lot of them for a while in and around North Nashville. I remember that. And we had one at Tennessee State University. During that workshop that was headed by the Red Cross, I asked, well, where are the Red Cross shelters? Because if something happens, we want to know where to go. I asked them if they had any maps. The Red Cross said that they didn't have any maps. And so at the time, I was working with some 9th graders at Pearl Cone High School. We had built a geographic information systems lab there. And I asked the Red Cross, give me what you have, and the 9th graders at Pearl Cone High School will create your maps. And what came out of that was the 9th graders at Pearl Cone High School. We had Miss Debbie Hirsch was their teacher. Bev Jacobs was working with those students also, and Dr. Marva Woods was the principal. I have to mention them. The students created the maps, and when the Red Cross came to school and released the maps, the Red Cross learned that the 37208 zip code area, which is commonly known as the lowest income zip code area in Nashville, the zip code area that has many, many people who don't have cars, many people relying upon public transit, was significantly underserved in terms of emergency shelters. So if there was a flood or if there was some catastrophe, people in the lowest income, the most vulnerable community in Nashville wouldn't have any place else to go. And the only way the Red Cross discovered that at the time was because we highlighted that on a map. And so that's the power of mapping and the power of using geographic information systems. There's some things that you just can't see in a data table, which is what the Red Cross had. When we put it on a map, they said, oh, we need to reach out to this community. And so about 80% of Red Cross shelters are faith-based organizations. And so not too long after that, they started to partner with the National Baptist Convention in trying to get more shelters reestablished in North Nashville, specifically in the 37208 zip code area. And so that was such a substantial finding, exposing that vulnerability in the 37208 zip code area, that each student and their teacher, Miss Debbie Hirsch, received a commendation from the Red Cross. You know, the Red Cross came out to the school at Pearl Cone and really was appreciative of what the students did. And they really served the community in a way that we found out later might have saved lives. Yes.
The very, very possibility of what could have happened and the ability to be able to predict in a real sense where you need assistance and where you need shelters. They had absolutely no idea in reference to that. Is that what we're saying?
Oh, absolutely. And so that was more of a, I guess, a qualitative look at vulnerability. And that was in 2000. That was actually in the spring of 2009 that we produced those Red Cross shelter maps with the students at Pearl Cone. And then, of course, we know what happened the following spring. Unfortunately, we were in the middle of an economic downturn, and so we lost many shelters during that time, many Red Cross shelters. And so when the flood hit in May of 2010, we were already down several shelters from where we were in 2009. And so and in the Bordeaux area, the area around the West Hamilton that was hit very hard, there were no shelters. And as you know, the Reverend Harold Love at St. Paul AME Church became essentially a de facto shelter that was didn't start out that way. It started out, hey, let's just make some sandwiches for people. And Reverend Love and his congregation wound up essentially being a staging area for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the OEM, the police, and other emergency responders for that critically struck area during the flood.
When you talk about shelters, exactly what are you talking about in a real sense in terms of what's the makeup of and what do they do?
Well, a shelter, of course, is often a faith-based organization, but they have to have supplies. They have to have enough food, bathroom facilities, water. It costs money to maintain a shelter, which is why we lost several during the economic downturn. And so what we've also gone to in terms of inner city emergency response is not depending so much on shelters or anyone coming. What inner city populations are told to do now is keep on hand a ready supply of food, water, and other materials, because you can't assume that people are going to be there to help you right away. And so that's what those early inner city emergency response trainings were about, being prepared in the event that something happens. You can't get away. Maybe you can't get out of town. You know, make sure you know where your medicine is. Make sure that you have some cash, because so many people deal with these debit cards that they don't carry cash around. But when there's a storm or a flood, oftentimes your electricity's out. Debit cards and ATM cards don't work when the electricity's out. You have to have some cash on hand, so that even in those times, if you have to buy supplies, you know, not everybody's going to be giving everything away. You're prepared in your own home, and that's a big lesson that we learned after Hurricane Katrina.
Very good. And of course, Dr. Patrick, we're getting ready for our second commercial break, and that's essentially the information that we are concerned with, to understand exactly what happened. You see, and that for whatever reason, to be able to justify and to try to create a situation so that some of the bad things that might have happened won't happen again, and perhaps be able to build on some of the good things that happened during that period. And I think that that's what we're trying to do here. And of course, we're going to take this second commercial break, and we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. David Padgett, and he's talking about the social impact of the Nashville flood of 2010, but he's also giving us additional information in reference to the situation prior to the flood and the situation after the flood. And of course, Dr. Padgett, let's continue our discussion during this final segment dealing with the social impact of the Nashville flood.
Okay, so even after the flood of 2010, we continued to look at this flood in terms of both its physical nature and its social impacts upon communities. In terms of its physical nature, a lot of people heard that it was a 500-year flood or it was a 1,000-year flood, but people should not say, oh, we got that one out of the way, there's not going to be another one for another 500 years. That is absolutely not true. We could have another flood of 2010 this year or next year or tomorrow. It's all based upon probability. And so understanding that this type of thing could happen again, we have to look at our preparedness, and specifically we want to almost triage the way that we go about protecting the community. And first determine, well, who needs help the most? Who has the greatest risk? Who has the highest vulnerability in the chance that this type of thing happens again? And it probably will, in all probability. And so I actually teamed up with Dr. Nia Fotheringham, who was at Meharry Medical College, and she wanted to look at the community vulnerability and to some degree from the public health standpoint. And so we used geographic information systems mapping and something called the Social Vulnerability Index, which is a way to quantify vulnerability, put it in numeric terms, and then take those numbers and put those numbers in a map. And then each census tract in Nashville, Davidson County was treated as a community. And so we wanted to see what are the most vulnerable communities in Nashville so that resources would go there first in the event of something like this. And so we worked and had some very interesting results. One of the results that we came up with was that in the most vulnerable communities, they have the least number of shelters or the lowest shelter capacity as compared to the least vulnerable community. So the people that need the least help have the most shelters and resources available. The people that need the most help have almost nothing. In fact, in the most vulnerable census tract, which was in the Nolensville, Murfreesboro Road area, which surprised us. We assumed that North Nashville, Bordeaux, somewhere in there would be the